All right, ready? All right. Let me issue a huge welcome to all of you to the Holocaust Center. Too loud? Okay. My name is Lori Levin. I am honored to serve as a board member and co-chair of the Lawyers Without Rights Exhibit Ambassador Committee. The Lawyers Without Rights exhibition is currently on display now through mid-August, explores how one government, the Third Reich in Germany, systematically undermined fair and just law through humiliation, degradation, and legislation leading to the expulsion of Jewish lawyers and jurists from the legal profession. The story of the fate of Jewish lawyers in Berlin and all of Germany is more than a historical footnote. It's a wake-up call that a system of justice free of improper political consideration remains fragile and should never be taken for granted. Before we begin the program, let me just share a special thanks to our exhibit partners, the American Bar Association and the German Federal Bar, as well as our exhibit sponsors, Allen and Knight, Kubicki Draper, Losey Law, and Jill Schwartz and Associates, PA. The exhibit is also supported by Orange County's Arts and Cultural Affairs, United Arts of Central Florida, and the State of Florida Division of Arts and Culture. Let me also thank our inaugural exhibit ambassador committee, Jill Schwartz, Bill Choike, Bethany Barber, Donna Hayes, Dane Simpkins, Bach McLean, and Liam King. Tonight's program features both a fireside chat and a panel discussion with experts who will explore what can be learned from the history of the Holocaust, the conflicts that may arise in the rule of law and how they may be addressed ethically, and what we can do today to preserve and protect the rule of law and the constitutional rights of all members of society. To kickstart our program, let me introduce our program moderator, the Honorable Judge Fred Lawton, and our first guest speaker, Consul General Andreas Siegel. Judge Lawton served as judge in the 9th Judicial District for 26 years, as chief judge of the circuit judge for the last 5 of these years. During his career on the bench, Judge Lawton sat in every division of the county court and various divisions of the circuit and the circuit court. Judge Lawton presided over the 9th Circuit's Business Court Division from 2007 to 2012. And as a judge, Judge Lawton presided over a wide variety of cases, including complex civil, criminal, probate, guardian, and mental health cases. Prior to serving as chief judge, he served as administrative judge in the civil and criminal divisions. Judge Lawton has also had the privilege of sitting as an associate judge on the 5th District Court of Appeal. Judge Lawton received his bachelor's degree and MBA from Routledge College and his law degree from Villanova University. Consul General Andreas Siegel is the Consul General of the Federal Republic of Germany. Consul General Siegel is a career diplomat with a broad range of international experience in strategic, political, economic, and cultural affairs. Consul General Siegel has had long-time connection with and affinity with the United States. He was an AFX exchange student back in Michigan during the bicentennial. And in the early 90s, he served as vice consul as the German Consulate General in Boston, Massachusetts. Before coming to Florida in July 2019, Consul General Siegel headed the German Consulate General in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. Prior to that, he was head of the Strategic Planning Division for External Cultural Policy and the Director General for Culture and Communication at the Federal Foreign Affairs Office in Berlin. He holds both a postgraduate diploma of the College of Europe in Bruges, Belgium, and a master's degree of French, English, and American Literature Linguistics for the University of Freiburg, Germany. And I will let Judge Lawton continue with the program.
Very good, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here, even though it was a little difficult for me to say no to this invitation because of someone that I'm very close to, but it's still a thrill to be here. David Simmons was teasing me earlier that at least as it pertained to tonight, I might have been a lawyer without rights to say no to my lovely wife when she said, how would you like to moderate tonight's discussion? This is going to be hopefully a informative and educational evening where we exchange ideas across all kinds of boundaries in the way that it should be done in our country, which is with respect for differing points of view, but also voicing how we feel about certain matters. We are, of course, going to talk a little bit tonight about politics and about society in general. So if you'll bear with me for a moment, there's already a little risk for what I'm about to do, but I'm willing to take it. I do want to recognize some folks in the audience who showed courage by running for public office. And I think that that is an act in America of great courage. And so if you'll permit me to, let me introduce, every one of you is special, but let me introduce some special guests that we have here tonight. So I want to recognize Linda Chapin, who served as mayor of Orange County in her career. And seated next to her is Susan Arkin, who served on the Orange County School Board. I think, Susan, it's fair enough for me to say even then that was an act of real courage. And today, in particular, it's an act of real courage. I want to recognize Judge Rand Wallace, who sits on the 5th District Court of Appeal. So Rand, if you'd stand for a moment so we can say hi to you. And I want to recognize Barry Laboda, who sat as an administrative law judge for the Social Security Division. And I think, with the exception of our panel, who I'm going to introduce a little bit later, I think maybe that's it for elected officials. This is the risky part. If you are an elected official, and when I was chief judge, this terrorized me every time. Have I missed anybody who holds elective office now or in the past? Okay, great. I'm going to invite Andreas to come on up and have a seat. Andreas, because you are our resident expert tonight. If I were a judge in the United States in 1919, I probably would take an oath that was similar to the oath that I took as a judge in 1993, which included in part that I swear that I will protect, defend, and uphold the Constitution of the United States and of the state of Florida. That's a shorthand version of a longer oath that I took. And were I a judge in Germany in 1919 or 1920, I would have taken an oath somewhat similar to that, to uphold the Constitution of the Weimar Republic. By the year 1934, this is the oath I would have taken as a judge. We swear by the Lord God, we swear by the spirit of our dead, that we will follow our leader as German jurists until the end of our days. So jurists in 1934 did not take an oath to the Constitution of the Weimar Republic, which was still in existence. They, in essence, took an oath to follow Adolf Hitler under a principle called the Führer Principle, which meant that whatever the Führer said the law was, they swore till their death to apply that law. We have invited Andreas here to give us, in about 30 minutes, a background with his expertise for how did Germany go from a republic with a constitution in 1919 to a totalitarian state in 15 years or 14 years. And so I'm going to turn the floor over to Andreas. I'll help steer this conversation a little bit if you'll permit me. But I wonder if you can share with our audience what happened in Germany at the end of World War I in 1918 and leading into 1919 when the Constitution of the Weimar Republic was adopted by the citizens of Germany.
Well, let's first try the technical aspect that seems to work. Well, thank you very much. I think you pointed already to a crucial point of these developments in the 1920s, and that is the type of constitution that we had in Weimar. And looking at it from today, we know that it was largely flawed, and it created not many opportunity for authoritarian spirited leaders to transform the institutions of that republic in a manner that finally Hitler did. And you were saying in 1934, jurists were swearing according to the Führer principle. And you said Weimar Republic was still in place. That's arguable.
Maybe not the Republic, but the Constitution was never completely revoked.
That's for sure. But if you look at the facts, the crucial period, the tipping point for the Weimar Republic when it was really lost and not recuperable, that was between January and March 1933. That's when a number of things happened which really made the Republic actually, well, it had been a republic without Republicans, as they said, or a democracy without Democrats before. Maybe I'll come back to that in a minute. But Hitler used a number of factors that were still in place, and a complacency also by sort of the economic elite of the country, and the total underestimation of his force in parliamentary terms, because they had risen sharply between 1930 and 1933 in parliamentary support. But also, I think they underestimated the potential of terror in the streets, which actually was instituted right after Hitler came to power as a chancellor. In a minority position, he was sort of accompanied and encircled, so thought the others, by still people who believed to be Democrats or Republicans of the Weimar Republic. But he used then one of the flaws of the Constitution, which is ruling by decree, to outmaneuver the parliament. And so that in March 1933, he had already, in February, there was a key event, which was the parliament, the Reichstag, was burned down. And
stop there for a moment. So the Reichstag is set on fire. I'm never sure by whom, but we know the Reichstag was set on fire. And I'm wondering, what analogy would we have in America to that? Would that be like burning down the Capitol of the United States? Was it that symbolic, the Reichstag?
Well, of course, formally yes, but institutionally, I would argue that today we have a sort of much more experience how democracy works than at the time. At the time, it was extremely experimental still, and that goes, if you go back to the 1918, the end of World War I, we had a lot of false expectations of what would happen afterwards.
Let's stop there for a moment. Okay. Can we set the tone? So Germany goes to war in World War I thinking we cannot be defeated. We're going to win World War I. We have the superior army, but then they run into the French, the British, and eventually the Americans come into the war with sort of overwhelming superiority in armaments and numbers. And so Germany, there's a revolution, small revolution. Germany signs, an armistice agreement. And what effect did that have on German psyche at the time?
Well, one of the little details to remember is that the Weimar Republic was declared twice, once by a social democrat and a couple of hours later by a communist. The first name was Scheidemann, the other was Liebknecht. The latter was murdered a few months later. The end of the war was seen by many as a sort of moral defeat and of course a big setback for Germany as a big country in Europe.
So Germany has to give up land.
It has to give up land, about 13%. That is mostly the Alsace-Lorraine area. And you have to understand that over the past of the centuries, like since 17th century, European countries had acted already always reacted in a culture of revenge. So if one war, some territory was taken, the other nation really did everything to regain that territory. And Alsace-Lorraine was a particularly sort of contested territory. And so that was seen by many as a real shame for Germans. But in particular, the fact that it was decided that Germany had to pay an sort of unpayable amount of reparations, and that on the grounds that everyone argued that Germany was guilty for the war. There's still an ongoing debate about who was actually guilty for, who is responsible for the starting of World War I. But Germany certainly had a very big part in that. So based on that, and on this culture of revenge, this reparation payment was decided, which was one of the factors which led to the first big crisis in Germany in economic terms. And at the latest in 1923 with the hyperinflation, where a loaf of bread cost 1 billion mark at the time. And also was accompanied by political extremism and political murders. And by the way, the name of Hitler is already notable during that period because he tried a coup in Munich in November 1923. Actually, for the German history, it's an interesting day, the 9th of November, 1923. Is one of the three, at least, days to remember. 9th of November, 1989, the day when the wall fell. 9th of November, 1938, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. And the 9th of November, 23. And actually, the 9th of November, 1918, it's when the Weimar Republic was declared. So very complicated history, but that's maybe one argument, one side sentence for later in our discussion. I think history is so important that we should not avoid the uncomfortable parts. And that's—
We're going to talk about that in a few minutes, but let's go on. I don't want to interrupt you there.
Yeah. So you
have loss of land, you have 100 billion in reparations or more. You have the sort of German psyche, like how did we lose this war? And there was a lot of talk, I know, in Germany at the time that Bolsheviks or others, Jews,
yes,
capitulated to end World War II when it shouldn't have happened. What else was? What else was?
Well, actually, two main conspiracy theories were circulating at that time. One was the stab in the back theory, which was that parts of the German population, in particular Jewish and Social Democrats and communists, had led actually to the military defeat. And they were called also the November Verbrecher, so the villains of November, because they were responsible for abolishing the monarchy. The emperor had to abdicate. And so the Republic really started under very bad augurs already, right from the beginning. And so you had a big faction of the population who was still believing in monarchy as the better way to govern a country. And later on, the president, Hindenburg, as he was elected in 1925, he is a rather famous general of World War I, and he was elected in particular because he was considered some kind of emperor, ersatz emperor, someone who could sort of be compared to the figure of an emperor, but in a republican function.
There was proportional representation in the legislative body, and there were numerous political parties. We're used to two, maybe historically three. I'm trying to think if we've ever had more than three or four. There were numerous political parties. So you had all these factions fighting with each other about political power.
Yeah.
You had reparations.
The second big flaw, which we have corrected in the German constitution after World War II, by establishing a hurdle or threshold of 5% for any political party. Otherwise, they cannot enter into parliament.
So you have the beer hall putsch in 1923.
Yeah.
You have Hitler being imprisoned and writing Mein Kampf, My Struggle.
Exactly, and that is a very important event, actually, as we know now, because it has influenced sort of the Nazi ideology enormously. And actually, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but he was released like after 6 months. And during these 6 months, it was Rudolf Hess, was also still sort of an infamous compagnon de route of him. He had been writing this Mein Kampf as and if people, and hundreds of thousands of people actually had read that in the 1920s, so still during the Weimar Republic, and had they read it well, they should have understood that this was really a very dangerous philosophy that was promulgated there.
So you're into the 20s, which weren't as crippling. There's some people even refer to the sort of German roaring 20s, a period of time when American banks were lending money and the economy was starting to recover, and there was renegotiation starting about the reparations and not so terrible. Then on October 29th, when the American stock market crashed, that had just had a worldwide effect on all kinds of economies. What did that do in Germany?
Well, as you said, the period between 1924, beginning of 1924 and 29 is known, you call it the roaring 20s, we call it the golden 20s, because it was really in particular in Berlin, flourishing arts, music, theater, whatever. Josephine Baker was a sort of an emblematic figure at that time as a symbol of liberty and creativity and all kinds of exotic allusions related to that. And at the same time, policy got more consolidated internally. You had moderate politicians at the helm, and you had a number of treaties and external foreign policy, which sort of brought Germany back into the game of being at, well, not exactly at the same height as the others, but still as a partner. And you had also some treaties to alleviate the burden of the reparations, like the Dawes Plan and later on the Young Plan. But that didn't solve the problem. But it was sort of a glimpse of hope that this was going to be better. But then, as you said, came the big crash in 1929, and that was the definitive turning point towards the even worse era.
So kind of crippling economic condition. I know I've read that in the morning, something might cost 1 mark. By the time you went to bed, it might cost 1,000 marks. I mean, it's almost hard to imagine the economic disparity that occurred after.
But that needs to be distinguished.
Okay.
That's a phenomenon which we had in 1923 with the hyperinflation. In 1929, we didn't have that, but we had an enormous sort of increase of unemployment. Within a couple of months, there were 5 million and more unemployed in the streets, with a number of social problems which are linked to that, obviously. And that also helped the Nazi party, the NSDAP, to increase their votes in parliamentary elections in 1930. But that still was relatively moderate. They had like 17% or so. But they were able to double that in 1933. They were at 38% or 37. So in the time between 1930 and 1933, or 1932 even, the situation got worse. There was unemployment. There was no governmental perspective on how this could be improved. The chancellor of the time, Brüning, had sort of the idea that a deflationary policy could sort of help solve this crisis, but did actually exactly the contrary. Instead of investing and in trying to lower the unemployment, it actually aggravated the unemployment and the situation in general. So that led again to a sort of also an increase of political extremism and the rise of the National Socialist Party.
So if we get into the early 30s, up to 1933, help us understand how in a society a group like the Nazis could gain power and gain control.
Well, they were seen as, well, with a strong, I mean, Hitler by then was becoming more and more known as sort of the leader of the Nazis. And he, even though he was a simple man, he didn't have a sort of higher education or so, but he had the gift of being a good rhetorician. He really, he was very interactive with the public as well. And one of his teammates, so to speak, Joseph Goebbels, who was later on his propaganda minister, he early on discovered the means of using the radio as a tool for influencing and manipulating the masses. And that was still a very new medium in Germany. And radio was introduced, I think, in 1925, 26. So there was no media competence, as we would say today, of how you perceive what's coming out of the radio, but it's rather somehow God sent, what is coming from the radio. And so that was a tool that was used by the Nazis, of course, even more when they were in power.
Do you think it was, do you have a sense whether it was clear to German citizens at that point how violent the Nazi party was, or was that hidden at the time and only surfaced later?
If you wanted to see it, you could see it because they had the young Nazi groups and the SA and SS, two violent sort of militia groups who actually were already present in the streets in the early 1930s. So, and they beat up whatever group they didn't like, in particular Jewish citizens and communists and social democrats. But it was tolerated to some extent because the mainstream population was still uncertain of where to go. I mean, they were still dissatisfied with what had happened after World War I, the reparations system and so on, and the economic crisis. And visibly, the government didn't have a clue of how to solve this. So that made the appeal of this extremist party, which at the time, Hitler, at least in his tone, was much more moderate than immediately after March 33.
So he becomes chancellor.
Yes.
And outline for our audience what happens rather quickly when he becomes chancellor and the powers that he invoked.
Yeah, so the idea was that with a parliamentary majority of other parties, but including also the right-wing, today we would call them extremist and monarchist party of NVAP, that was a party which was, principally speaking, Republican, but they were basically the coffin bearers of the Weimar Republic, actually, to allow Hitler to go on with his seizure of power. And then, so beginning with the chancellor before him, Brüning, he had started to rule by decree because there was no parliamentary majority for his policy. And Hitler seized on that. And very quickly, and of course, the fire of the Reichstag in February 33 was ideal pretext to have opposition people arrested. I think right after the fire of the Reichsbahn, 5,000 opposition politicians were arrested. And a particular decree declared a state of emergency, and then led to the famous Ermächtigungsgesetz, so the law of empowerment, which gave basically all the powers to the chancellor and abolished the rights of the parliament.
Got to that act. Wasn't there an article included in the Weimar Constitution that under a state of emergency that the chancellor could take power and pass laws without the involvement of the legislature?
Yes, well, that's the governance by decrees, and that's again, after World War II, we learned these lessons that this governing by decrees is
bad idea.
Very, very bad idea, and has to be conditioned very, very closely. And then one other phenomenon which led to the instability of the Weimar Republic and the changing chancellors, you had a lot of chancellors there, was that there was no obligation actually to nominate a successor. Which in Germany now we have what we call the constructive vote of defiance, or I don't know exactly how you call that. So if the parliament decides they don't want to live with this government anymore, they don't want this chancellor anymore, they have to be able to mobilize a parliamentary majority to have a successor. Otherwise, that doesn't work constitutionally, which is a much more constructive way to develop policy.
But when Hitler becomes chancellor, he invokes that clause in the Constitution saying, because we have such an emergency because of the Reichstag, because of instability in the society, then he sees his power to pass laws without the involvement of just himself.
Yes.
And then he passes a law, in essence, that makes him the supreme leader.
Yeah, and that continues later on in 1934 when he even takes the power of the president, of the chancellor and president together. The Hindenburg dies, and then this famous Führer principle, which you mentioned, is the guiding principle of political life, and no more the Weimar Constitution.
And by that time, democracy is gone.
By that time, democracy is definitively gone. Parliament doesn't have any role anymore. We have a one-party state. Even in 1933, in November, Hitler organized a snap election, but just with one party to vote, namely his own. So obviously so that the Nazi party then had the monopoly of political life already.
And then we get a series of actions, including the ones that are represented in our exhibit, that decommissions Jewish lawyers and Jewish jurists, and a whole series of supposed legislative acts from one supreme leader.
And very, very quickly, actually, that happens immediately after this enabling act in March 1933. So in April, you have already these decrees sort of dismissing or a sort of interdiction of exercising the legal profession for certain categories, etc. And you had also the first concentration camp, Dachau, which was founded in the same year. So the signs, the signals were already all over the place. You had the first burning of books also just 2 months later in public places, huge book burning actions. So yeah, in 1933, everyone was able to see what was going to happen.
By then it was too late.
Yes.
Were there points along the way where maybe it wouldn't have been too late had there been resistance, looking back?
Well, the last point was this enabling law. And actually there was one politician, a very courageous one. His name was Otto Wels. He was the head of the Social Democrats in the parliament then. And he stood up And if anyone has the opportunity to read that speech, it's one of the most beautiful speeches for democracy that I've ever read. And he argued, well, you can change whatever the political landscape here, but you will not be able to kill our honor and dignity, etc., by the actions that you're undertaking. But of course, Hitler got through with that anyway.
Then we come back to this exhibit and how lawyers were decommissioned, jurists were decommissioned. I know it started in the legal profession. I understand that spread to almost all of the professions.
Civil service, yes. Mm-hmm.
Medicine, law, civil service. And in those professions, Jews were decommissioned from holding office. Yes. And eventually, Jews had no civil rights at all. And in fact, their civil life was dead, their civil life. And then eventually they were killed.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this, Andreas. In Germany today, you have this history that's so horrific. Is that taught in the school system?
Oh, yes, very intensely. Well, it's really frightening to see that in 1933, this started with boycotting sort of Jewish shops, for example. Don't buy at Jewish shops. Violence in the streets. Then the Kristallnacht in 1938, the sort of indiscriminate destruction of property and the arrest of thousands of people. And then sort of the next and unique and sort of unparalleled step was the Wanzi Conference in 1942, when sort of a group of state secretaries and so talked over dessert about the extermination of the Jewish race in general. And that was what they call the final solution procedure, which is an industrialized extermination. And that one always has to be clear that this is really unique, and that's why really we should all be together to say never again.
Is there any conversation that you know of in Germany that this history is historical? That is, there aren't many survivors who participated in this, that it's horrific, that it makes us look bad, and so why should we dwell on that part of our German history? Maybe we should just put that to the side and look forward so that we don't really cover this period that makes us feel so uncomfortable, makes us feel guilty, raises issues that I didn't have any involvement in, my ancestors may have had involvement in, so let's move on. Any conversations like that happening in Germany that you know of?
You do have these conversations as well, but I would argue the prevailing view is, and that is, of course, based on a number of discussions and evolution over time on how the World War and the Nazi period was perceived. Our president von Weizsäcker, he made a famous speech in 1984, and for the first time from sort of a German politician, the word liberation was pronounced to describe the end of World War II, which was not sort of political use before. And you can probably take that point in history also as a change of mind in terms of commemoration, how Germany commemorates history. And I would say that since then, there has been even a more active, proactive sort of research on these topics, on Weimar and on the Nazi period, which is, of course, being taught in school very actively as well.
All right. Well, I mean, we gave you an impossible task, which was to condense 15 years of history into 30 minutes, which is pretty difficult to do, but I'm going to ask the audience to join me in thanking you for giving us this overlay. So if you'll permit me, let me invite up one by one our panelists. So let me start with David Simmons, who's with us. And David Simmons is the founding partner of DeBobie & Knight & Simmons law firm in Orlando, Florida. He's the financial and managing partner of the firm. He's responsible for the firm's overall practice and day-to-day operation. In 2000, David was elected to the Florida House of Representatives, and he represented portions of Seminole and Orange County until 2008. And then in 2010, he was elected to the Florida Senate, where he served for 10 years until November 3rd of 2020. David graduated with highest distinction from Tennessee Technological University and then attended Vanderbilt University Law School. And I want to invite him up to the stage. And in doing so, I do want to share with you that when I was chief judge and we were struggling for an expansion of the number of judges and the financing of the judiciary and the kind of dire circumstances that we were in, that David was a personal champion for us. And being on the floor here publicly, I get a chance to publicly thank him for his help there. So won't you join me in welcoming David Simmons? And next, I want to introduce to you Anna Escamami, who's a member of the Florida House of Representatives, and she represents District 47 in Orange County. And Representative Escamami was born and raised in Orlando. She's the daughter of working class immigrants who came to Florida from Iran in search of the American dream. She went to Orlando public schools and then to the University of Central Florida. She earned dual degrees as an undergraduate and graduate student. She's working on her PhD from the university in public affairs. She's worked in nonprofit, professional, and state strategic enterprises, and she was an advisor. She was elected to the Florida House in 2018 and reelected in 2020, and she has made history already as the first Iranian American elected to any public office in the state of Florida. And she has championed critical issues like economic justice, environmental protection, equality for all, funding for public schools, human trafficking, and sexual assault prevention. She supports the arts and cultural funding. And I also get to say that when I was chief judge, Anna also was a representative who worked tirelessly to get funding for the judicial system, to improve our system of justice, to make sure it was fully funded, and then to make sure that it improved the way that it did business. And honestly, there's miles to go in that area, and Anna was a champion in that regard. So it's my pleasure to introduce and bring to the podium Anna Escamami. And next, I have the honor of introducing the Dean of the Florida A&M University College of Law, Deidre Keller, who is the sitting dean for that school in downtown Orlando. It's great to have a law school in downtown Orlando. And prior to joining FAMU Law, she was the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at Ohio Northern University at the Claude Petit College of Law, where she taught for 10 years. And her writing centers on intellectual property, personhood theory, and critical race theory, which we may talk a little bit about tonight. And academically, she strives to evaluate intellectual property while also emphasizing racial justice. Now, prior to teaching, Dean Keller practiced law in Atlanta, Georgia, with two powerful law firms, Sutherland, Asbill, and Brennan, and Seyfarth Shaw, LLP. She is a native of Georgetown, Guyana. She grew up in the Bronx in New York. She earned her Juris Doctorate with honors from Emory University and her Bachelor's of Art in English and Sociology from Yale University. And so it's my pleasure to introduce the Dean of FAMU's Law School. No, go right ahead. That gives me a minute to switch gears.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
All right, this is the photograph before the heavy lifting.
So much.
So my first question to the panel is this. Many Americans can't imagine our country as anything other than a democracy. It's baked into our consciousness, and for many of us, it's enshrined in our documents. Yet democracy is not destiny, as we heard a little bit about from our previous presentation. It's fragile, and a society can, we know, under certain conditions, lose its democratic foundations if the citizens permit it to happen. So my first question, and I think I'll start at my far left and work inward, is, do you see any issues or do you have any concerns where our democratic principles and values might be at risk? There's a softball for you, Dean. There we go.
Yeah, do I see any issues? Yes, I see lots of issues, right? The pleasure and honor of doing the work that I do in educating future generations of lawyers is trying to teach, those who are coming into the profession how to be the safeguards, right, against those issues. The thing that I will say is, I don't think that this time is really all that different from other times in American history, which is to say, I don't think our democracy has ever been without the potential for devolution, right? And so I think that the question is so important, right? Because our democracy is only as good as we make it. And that starts from everything from, voting in elections to protecting the right to vote in elections to, educating our children about history and about civics and about the law. And so, that there are potential issues at each of those stages and places. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us as citizens to be on guard, right, for those issues.
So, Dean, in the last 3 elections, just slightly over 50% of American eligible to vote voted. I think the last election, it got into just about 60%. Before that, it was in the 50s. Before that, it was in the low 50s. I'm talking about presidential elections, right. So not the midterms. So we're roughly at about just over half of our citizens exercising this fundamental right that helps protect democracy and ensure democracy. What can we do in that area, in your opinion? How do we get more citizens involved? And are you concerned about anything happening today that would decrease the turnout for voting?
Absolutely. I think that, complacency was mentioned by Consul Siegel, and I think that's part of what we're seeing in those low voter turnouts, right? People have to feel like their vote will matter and that voting has an impact on the law, on the society that they live in. And I think, again, all of us have a role to play in that. So, in my other life, when I'm not deaning, I'm the mother of 6 children. And these are conversations that I have with my children about the importance of being, of doing that civic duty, because that's what it is, right? And, I think that it's easy to get complacent. There's a lot going on. I just described myself a little bit earlier as the COVID dean, right? I started this deanship on July 1, 2020, in the middle of, a health emergency that none of us have any living memory of. There's a lot going on. And at the same time, we have to be vigilant about exercising the right to vote. I think it's so important, but how do you sort of fight against that complacency? I wish I had a perfect answer for that question. I do not.
Yeah, I'm tempted to find out what's more challenging, raising 6 children or being dean of a law school. But we're gonna hold on to that for just a moment, because we're going to go to
They're more similar than you might
they're very similar. We're going to go to Senator Simmons. Senator Simmons, any concerns you have about the fragility of democracy, and do we have any values that are at risk?
Well, I can say from the time that I in 2018 was sworn in as the president pro tem of the Senate, and had the opportunity to be at the rostrum so many times, because the president of the Senate, Senator President Galvano, during the time of the when things are being done in the Senate is being administered and laws are being passed, you have the opportunity to see the tremendous beauty of our system and the history that is built into it, and it's just incredible to be there, putting that together in the sense of directing that traffic. What is real clear to me is, just as you've stated, that it is a democracy, a republic that is truly always must be looked at as the potential of losing it. It's very fragile. The beauty of all of this is that our founding fathers, when it was all put together, came to the conclusion that after King George had been such a tyrant, that they decided that they would trade off efficiency for the assurance that there would be no one who could become a tyrant and take control. That is what is so unique about our system, and I believe that has kept it together in times that, for example, before the Civil War, in which literally the lack of civility, the disparity that existed between the beliefs of those in the ruling South and other areas of the nation were such that that the dialogue was filled with all kinds of really ugly statements and of course ugly deeds as well. But what happens is that you see this and you see the beauty of being able to distribute power, because our founding fathers believed that any person was capable of becoming that tyrant. And so what happened is they made sure that there were three branches that were independent branches of our nation, the judiciary, the legislative, as well as the executive. And then they were so afraid that the legislators would become tyrannical, they split it between the House and the Senate. There was a purpose behind all of this and a genius behind all of it. It wasn't perfect in the sense of that things that they compromised on at the very beginning did not need to be improved and have a more perfect union later on. But one thing was real clear. They understood the need to trade off the efficiency of an autocrat with the assurance that there would not be that tyrant who would take control. And there have been people who have tried to do that in our system. And the beauty of our system is that it has a lot of safety valves that exist. And the free and independent judiciary, one that is sworn to our Constitution. All the time that I was in the Senate and in the House, as the chair of the Judiciary Committee in both the House and the Senate, I was a firm believer in our judiciary, because it is, in fact, here in Florida, truly the best in the nation. And it's not perfect, but it's the best in our nation, therefore the best in the world. And I strove, diligently to make sure that interpreter of our Constitution would be in fact strong, and that's what has kept, in many instances, the chances of someone taking over. And there will be people who attempt to be tyrants in the future, and there were in the past. And so, yes, it's very.
Senator, let me ask you this question. Some people argue today that the legislative branch has ceded some of its power to the executive branch. That is, in this original sort of balance and design that fathers came up with, that the legislative branch had a little more power than they're willing to either exercise today, or they've voluntarily given up to the executive branch. I'm curious about your thoughts about that, whether whether the design itself has been weakened a little bit because the executive has become stronger than it was originally designed. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that there's an ebb and a flow between the legislative branch and the executive branch. And I believe that certainly if the executive is one who is very forceful and popular, then there is the belief that there is a seeding of wishes and desires and trying to meet the desires of the executive that goes on. But I can also tell you from being in the midst of the decision making in the Senate that there is, when you have the right leadership, that calming that exists that is never heard or never seen, because what happens is that things that may be desired by the executive never get fulfilled, because even though there is a desire to have that appearance of unity, and there is unity, but there is a tremendous amount of.
So the governor didn't get everything he wanted when you were in the Senate. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that I don't believe very many governors get everything they want. As a matter of fact, they find out that in our system of government that when you want something, you feel like you have not been given it, and you can't believe that the leaders of the House and the Senate are not willing to go as far as you might be willing to go.
Thank you, Senator. Let me go to Representative Escamilla.
Thank you so much.
Values, democracy. I imagine you might have some concern.
I have many. Well, first of all, it's such an honor to be here and share space with some incredible community leaders. And this is a heavy topic, but an important one. I want to acknowledge that and thank everyone for making the time to have it, because that's what we must do in order to protect and save democracy in this state and in this country. And to the question of, is this system fragile? I would just encourage you to look a month ago with the Dobbs decision out of the Supreme Court of the United States, where 50 years of precedent is just gone in a day. And since then, we've seen 13 states ban abortion at different degrees, including Florida at 15 weeks, with no exceptions for rape, incest, or human trafficking. And of course, a concurring opinion in that decision that could impact LGBTQ plus rights, that could impact access to contraception, and so many other rights that I know for my 32 years of existence, I've always considered to be known and there and present, and something I didn't have to worry as much about till this moment. And so I have a lot of concerns about the consolidation of power. And when I also heard our council talk about the use of radio as a means of spreading propaganda, I believe the equivalent today is social media. And when you mention how not many people knew what radio was or how to use it or how to fact check it, social media is the same thing. There are so many, first of all, just fake accounts, propaganda accounts. There's memes that have no citations that also travel in spaces of different languages. So if you're someone who is multilingual and you're on a different platform, there's data information being transferred that is completely, inaccurate and spreading very hateful comments about whether it's other political parties or people. Because I'm someone who stands up for LGBTQ plus rights, I'm constantly referred to as a groomer now, and that is a new occurrence. That was a social media phenomenon that started on a TikTok platform and then got mainstreamed by our governor's press secretary. And now every day I go on social media, I am called a groomer for defending the dignity of people in this community. And so not only is that, grounded in rampant disinformation, but it's designed to silence those who speak out. And so it's designed for people like me to give up and to say, I'm going to stop trying. It's not worth it anymore. I'm going to get off Twitter because it's too much for me to handle. And to the question earlier around, voter engagement, voter apathy, there is a feeling of despair right now, especially when you have a Congress that is at this point led by one party, with some numbers and defectors. But I mean, voters and community members look at that and say, well, when the Republicans were in charge, nothing happened. When Democrats are in charge, nothing happened. So why does it matter, right? And so I do think part of our challenge is education, is helping folks know how to fact check, where to go to get the best information, and building efficacy, realizing that democracy is reliant on your participation, and it won't work if you don't get plugged in. And so helping the next generation of young people not feel that sense of despair. And let's be real, for Generation Z, which we have some leaders in the space, Generation Z is growing up in an environment where there was constant war, there is constant gun violence, and your first election is a very polarizing one where there's an insurrection, a few weeks later. And so that's not an environment to stay plugged in. That's an environment where you're thinking about leaving the country. And I'm not just being dramatic. Like when I talk to students, they often come to me really upset because they don't know what to do. And so that despair has to be combated with a sense of purpose. And I think there's no greater purpose than protecting our democracy, than calling people in before we call them out, like creating spaces of dialogue. So we can't solve problems like we've done before in the legislature. But these days, the conversation is so dominated by culture wars that we're not even addressing the daily struggles of our constituents.
One thing I wonder, I'm curious about the whole panel's position on this is, historically, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, they could be very intellectual, but they could also get down and get nasty with one another. And then there have been many periods in history where the political opponents have been really, nasty. And I'm wondering, are we in a different era where if you hold a different opinion, you're viewed as an enemy, not sort of a respected member of the opposition party,
right,
who has a different perspective than you have, but you respect them as citizens, but they're the enemy if they don't agree with me. Are we in a different era? Have we always been that way? Where are we with this different, and the vehicle now is social media, but it's been newspapers, radio, TV, now social media. Are we in a worse place, the same place? What do you think about that?
So I'm curious what my colleagues say. My first reaction is, we have been in moments of contention. I mean, in American history, there's been decisions decided by dueling, like physically with weapons. And so, I'm not going to dismiss that there's been tension, there's been civil wars, but I will say that it is cool to be angry today. And that's not a right or left thing. It is just, if you are petty on the internet, you get more traction that way versus, being bipartisan. Like if I express an act of bipartisanship, for example, being successful in getting a 1-year tax break for children's diapers. That was something that I worked on with my Republican colleagues. And so I thank them for their support. I will instantaneously get people who are mad because I thanked a Republican. And so it creates this toxic environment where, people expect things to be black and white, but they're not. Like everything is nuanced. And so I feel like it's harder to model bipartisanship, and it's harder to model opportunities of commonality because there's almost like this, expectation or desire to be divisive. And I think it also is up to the leaders you elect and how they model that back. But it's much more popular and easier to be vitriolic, to have an enemy. Like having an enemy is also easier to mobilize people around because, if we're trying to solve, for example, the affordable housing crisis, there's not really one target in that crisis. There's a lot of issues. It's much more complicated for me to explain that to someone than to say this party's at fault or this developer's at fault, right? And so no problem is solved through that, but that's like, I don't know, I guess the gut reaction is to identify an enemy and go after them because you can build more attention around that.
Yeah, I don't know that it's unfair to say that there's probably a large public perception today that if you belong to a particular political party at the state level or the national level, you have to line up
Right.
Even if you kind of, intellectually evaluate a proposal and think that doesn't offend me, that's not a bad idea. If the party's opposed to it, you can't break ranks. And we see that nationally, just this week with Senator Manchin. Where are you? You're here, you're there. You both sat in the legislature. I'm just kind of curious, is that a real issue? Is that magnified by the media? What are your thoughts about sort of loyalty to the party or loyalty to a proposal?
I can give you my thoughts. And I mean, the speech I gave when I accepted the presidency pro tem of the Senate was civility. And my entire time in the legislature, both in the House and then in the Senate, was spent trying to take the very same thing that is pushed so hard in the judiciary, which is civility. And that was a topic that I gave and I spoke about in that acceptance. And you can, in fact, be civil and say no or disagree and work to change things. And in the Senate in particular, that is easier to do because there are only 40 individuals in the Senate, in the Florida Senate. And so what I can say to you is that it's easy to be vitriolic. It's easy to say things that are inappropriate. And if you are able to restrain yourself, because I can tell you, I don't know how many times I said, because I was able to get massive legislation, landmark legislation for the state of Florida passed, and people said, how do you do it? And I said, I don't call the people who I disagree with names. And I said, you go ahead and do that. They'll always remember the humiliation and the ridicule that you have made of them. And do you really think that they're going to try to help you afterwards?
Right.
And so I worked very hard to treat people with respect, no matter who they were and who they are. And through that system, able to pass, significant legislation. And at the same time, unbeknownst to many people, take some really bad stuff and make it a lot better.
What do we do? And hopefully it's a minority, but with the handful of people who you turn on the news, you turn on social media, and their whole platform is to just destroy the other person. Right. I don't know if they pass any legislation. I'm not sure that they do. And I have, people kind of on both sides of the spectrum in mind, maybe more on one side these days, but both sides of the spectrum, whose whole, it seems like their whole approach is to be outrageous and attack and make enemies of people who disagree with them. And that seems to have heightened in the last, I don't know how long, decade, 6 years, I don't know. What are your concerns about those people seem to be getting all the attention as opposed to what you said? I'm not going to call a person who disagrees with me the enemy because next week I might be going to them and saying, I need your help with this bill.
And it's very real and it's very problematic. And the first thing you do is restrain from acting the same way. And if you go ahead and engage in the very same kind of conduct, then you're no better than the person who is doing the same thing. So the natural reaction,
feel free, don't hold back.
But that doesn't mean that you reduce your resolve to do the right thing.
Right.
And and that's the way you handle it. And I can tell you that there were times that I didn't go along with what certain people in at the time leadership in one or both of the houses, particularly the one time where my chairmanship got removed because of a vote that I took, and so there's a lot of pressure that's put to go along, and you have to sometimes just say no, and so again, your resolve must be even strengthened to do the right thing and to do it in a way that in fact will engender respect and dignity for everyone.
Great, thank you.
Can I add something real quick,
Absolutely.
very briefly? I just want to point a personal privilege. I first met Senator Simmons as an advocate at Planned Parenthood, and I'm a Democrat, he is a Republican. His door was always open to us, and his staff was phenomenal. And some of my proudest moments at Planned Parenthood were inviting Republican legislators to come tour our health centers. And it was a moment where we took no photos. There were no selfies. I had to remind them, like, you're not going to catch on fire, don't worry. And it was a very eye-opening experience for them because they got to actually understand, like, the organization behind the talking points, right, behind the myth, and really get to meet patients, understand, like, why these health centers are so important and how the majority of the work is preventative in nature. And for those who find themselves in need of an abortion, they should have all options in front of them objectively to make an informed decision without political interference. And so, you know, I just want to echo these points being made that you don't have to mimic that energy back. And it's funny, when I got elected, I gave myself this rule that I wasn't going to ever, like, attack a colleague on Twitter. Like, I was never going to be the one to start that. Now, of course, if someone throws a punch at me, like, I can't ignore to some degree. I have to acknowledge and dismiss. But I'm never the first person to make that attempt because I think it's immature. I think it's also disrespectful. And at the end of the day, these are my coworkers. I'm supposed to find some way to work with you. And it's not easy, and some characters are more difficult than others, but to echo the center's points, like, you have to try to model, what you want others to reflect.
Well, we have miles to go before we sleep. I do want to get to Andreas because I'm very curious of your perspective, which is you love America, but you have an outsider's perspective in a sense. And what do you identify, if anything, about the fragility of American democracy?
Well, yes, thank you. Indeed, I'm supposed to be exercising diplomatic restraint, but this is
we want to hear it.
This is a topic which is really fascinating and very important. So, I mean, if you look at it from an analytical and structural point, I think the first thing to say, or I would like to say, is sometimes it would benefit the discussion here in the US if people looked also what's happening elsewhere, beyond the borders and beyond the holy shrine of the US Constitution, which of course is a very, very key document. But the way it is being interpreted, mostly in a so-called originalist fashion, is, in my view, and I think many other Europeans would share that, is not particularly productive in solving today's problems, or not all the time anyway. Another issue is, and that is sort of derived also from the Constitution, is in a federal state, what is the balance and the distinction of power between the federal subjects, so the states, and the federation? In Germany, we are confronted with that debate also all the time. But it seems to me sort of a common sense that there are a number of matters that should be, for the betterment of everyone, should be sort of standardized or ruled sort of in a common manner. I would say, so obviously security, etc. That's definitely a national competence. Public health, where the big debates obviously about that. And one other thing is electoral law. We've seen enormous discussions about the different aspects on how presidential elections are being organized very differently in many states, and that can create at least misunderstandings, if not more. So that to me seems to be an important sort of reflection point. Do we have the right balance between the powers of the states and of the federation? Separation of powers, that was a topic which was mentioned, the role, sort of increasing role maybe of the executive. Let me just mention one example, and I won't speak long on that. Redistricting in Florida. you had a common vote of the Senate and the House in February this year, which decided the plan, which was moderately modifying the electoral districts. But where are we now? The governor issued a veto and said, no, we should do it in a different way for different arguments, etc. And in the end, the presidents of the Senate and of the House wrote a letter to the office of the governor, say, well, obviously you want to do it differently, then do it yourself. And that is sort of, for me, a very problematic development concerning the separation of power. And indeed, in the end, it was the office of the governor who actually redistricted, did the redistricting. And that is still the regulation. This is a regulation which will count for the midterm election, even if it is contentious still in court. But that will not be changed now, since the candidates are already running, the primaries are ongoing, etc. So, yeah, separation of powers is, I think, an important point. You mentioned this media competence and sort of populism tendency. This morning I visited Full Sail University, which is sort of one of the prominent avant-garde entertainment industry universities, and in particular also with game developing, etc. But it should be noted as well that there are certain game developer platforms which are being used by extremist groups because most of the games also that you can buy or play are sort of in a confrontational or competitive way, and often stigmatizing the other side. And if you are in that environment, even if it's just an online environment, that has an influence on your attitude, how you socialize with other people. So that should be, I mean, universities who do not pay attention to that, I would definitely advise them to do so. Well, maybe I can stop there. But for example, there are, of course, if you look at the debate on electoral integrity, for example, a famous buzzword. As a foreign observer, I have the impression that this question has been created, or the electoral security issue, by a presidential candidate who about 3 months before the elections announced that actually the only way he could lose was if the others sort of committed massive fraud. And that is profoundly, profoundly undemocratic to say that. And well, we all know what's happening afterwards. But I've had the opportunity to witness the exact opposite of what we were discussing earlier on, namely the passage from an autocracy to a democracy in an African country, Malawi, not to name it, in 1992 to 94. 92 was a period where opposition politicians were thrown to the crocodiles virtually. They are numerous there, the crocodiles. In 1994, after a referendum to abolish the one-party rule and to re-establish multi-party rule, and afterwards we had elections, multi-party elections, the opposition won, and the president, a 91-2-year-old dictator, went to the radio and said, okay, that's the game, you've won, I will retire now, up to you now. That was an image which I would like to see everywhere. And unfortunately, it's not a common practice to do that, but that helps democracy much more than many other educational tools that you try to.
So Andres, in our lifetime, my lifetime at least, you know, we had one presidential race that ended up in the court system.
Right.
All right. Then the decision was made by the court system. This reflects a little bit back to what Senator Simmons said. And one of the candidates, who I'm not certain believed he lost, but at least said, I have lost this election because it's very important that we have the peaceful transfer of power. In the last election, we have a candidate who said the only way I can lose is if there is cheating. And to me, I don't know that there's a bigger threat to democracy if we can't have faith in the electoral system where we choose our leaders. If someone can credibly say, if I lose, I had to have been cheated out of that. That to me concerns me as the biggest slide towards what you talked about from, you know, Germany, from the Weimar Republic to I am so important to this country that the only way I can't be its leader is because citizens have cheated. And then that slid over to violence. I mean, you know, our capital was never attacked in our history until the result of the presidential election. Even in 1812, they didn't get through the doors. And so, yeah, when you say electoral votes, if we lose as a citizenry faith that when we go to the polls that has integrity and the results are the results, when really, you know, you're not always going to win, you're not always going to lose. But if you have no faith in that outcome, then I think, to me, that might be number one towards the slide of where are we going as a democracy. So I appreciate your perspective. Particularly as an outsider, you've identified so many things for us to think about. I do want to, if you'll permit me to, though, kind of slide into an area that I really want to hear from the panel about. It refers back to something you and I talked about earlier. And that is how, as a society, do we educate ourselves about our history where we don't devalue our fundamental values, but we are willing to recognize weaknesses or problems or deficiencies that we as a country had along the way without devaluing the importance of being an American, but to recognize that we had slavery in this country. And I asked you about what was going on in Germany because I was curious if at any point in time the Germans have said, well, it's uncomfortable for our school children to hear about the Nazi regime. So let's not talk about it because they didn't exist and they weren't around for the Nazi regime. So it's not their fault. And they come home with feelings of angst and anxiety. And some parents today are arguing, you know, I don't want an emphasis on the weaknesses of our system as we evolved, because it makes the current crop of students, they're not responsible for it. It just makes them uncomfortable. I'm very curious, Dean, since you live in the world of academia, about your thoughts in this area. And if it segues naturally, because I think this term is so widely used and so little understood by anyone, at some point I'd like you, because you've taught the subject, to tell us what critical race theory is in a law school setting. Okay. Because for the love of me, I can't, when I ask people, what is it? No one can define it for me. And I'm hoping you can. But first, your thoughts about education and how do we talk about historical aspects of our country that were difficult, and then maybe critical race theory too.
So the thing that I'll say about the educational piece, and now I'm talking about educating children, right, is I think this is a question that has plagued us always, right? And so I think back to the period immediately following the Civil War. And the question was immediate, right? What are we going to teach in schools about the Civil War? Well, if you go back and look at the textbooks from that period, the Daughters of the Confederacy were very successful in teaching lost cause theory effectively. Basically, that the South was cheated, right? I mean, effectively, that was the teaching. And so for generations in the South, that was what children were taught about the Civil War. And, you know, specifically that the Civil War was fought over states' rights. Well, states' rights to do what, right? So sort of removing slavery from the center of the Civil War narrative, that was, and that, you know, the North abused the South in the period of Reconstruction. Like that was the tenor of teaching about the Civil War in the time immediately following the Civil War. And so this idea, right, that we have to teach history in a way that is protective of children, that's not a new idea, right? And in a way that's protective of their heritage, right? None of that is new. That's old stuff dressed up in new clothes. And so when, you know, that is bandied about as critical race theory, right? Oh, K to 12 students are being taught critical race theory. I can tell you they are not, right? I have not done a full survey of public education materials, but I have had 6 children go through public schools in Florida, Ohio, Georgia, right? So I have a pretty broad sense of what's going on in public schools, and I can tell you it has nothing to do with critical race theory, which leads to the question of what is critical race theory, right? And what it is really an approach to the study of law that centers race, right? And so when you think about the story of American jurisprudence, we can talk about the Constitution, right? When you think about the Constitution, the critical race theory asks the question, what impact did race have on the Constitution, right? If you ask that question, you come pretty quickly to the 3/5 Compromise and the Electoral College and et cetera.
The Fugitive Slave Incorporation.
Right, all of that.
Not banning the Atlantic slave trade for 20 years.
Exactly. And so that's what critical race theory does, right? It asks us to think about American law through the lens of race. Right? That's what it is. And it is generally taught as a methodology and a practice to law students who are interested in it. Not even to all law students. I want to be really clear about that, right? To law students in advanced courses who have an interest in the role race has played in the development of American law. So this notion that teaching American history in ways that make people uncomfortable equals critical race theory, that's just not the case, right? Teaching American history, frankly, education should make us uncomfortable, right? If you're comfortable, you're probably not learning.
That explains my whole math experience. Go right ahead.
Mine too. Listen, so certainly calculus, right? I'm still uncomfortable many years later. So really, if you're not uncomfortable, you're not learning. And so this idea that education should make folks comfortable, and I say, you know, folks, because children of color in these rooms where slavery isn't being discussed, where the civil rights movement isn't being discussed, they're not comfortable, right? So make some folks comfortable is, in my mind, nonsense. That's not what education is for.
Senator, what do you think? How do we cover our glories and our sins when we teach children about the history of our country and democracy?
We remember that even from the time of the Declaration of Independence, that when Thomas Jefferson drafted that document, if you look at the draft, it spoke about the need for equality and actually condemned the concept of slavery. But the fact of it is it was too early, too much to get the southern states to go along with 13 colonies to join together. And so there was compromise. And our original Constitution that dealt with the issue of slavery was, it's boiling up. And by the time it got to be the election in 1860 of Abraham Lincoln and his condemnation of slavery and everything that went along with that, it came to a head, and it resulted in what is an improvement to make our union more perfect. And boy, was it you're talking about things, if you say they're bad now, think about how much, individual rights have over the last 100 years improved. And all of the things that we've done to assure the freedoms that we have. It's not perfect, but I can tell you, you don't see people, leaving here, going to, to other places. They're all coming here. It's because it's so good, even though it's got its imperfections. And let me tell you, democracy is not pretty. It is not pretty. Linda will tell you what it's like. And if you ever think that being a candidate is easy, because all the time that I was practicing law and still practice law, but and the cordiality and the decorum of our judicial system and being in court, and then get into the campaign system, and you find out how absolutely ugly it can be, and how you have to really toughen up, because democracy is not pretty. And so, but it is effective, and it is the best system that exists.
Senator, I'm in complete agreement with you. And that's why whenever I get the chance to applaud people who are courageous enough to seek political office, because I think it takes a strong degree of courage to run for political office today, just because of that. And so I'm with you. And I'm also with you on, the statement that, we have our flaws, but we're the best organized system. What I'm curious about a little bit is it harmful? Is it harmful at any age group to be able to point out that the man who wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that people are created equal, all men are created equal, but let's broaden it to men and women people." Is it harmful to point out that person enslaved people? Are we damaging ourselves by also pointing it out, or are we pointing out how imperfect we are as a race by human beings? We're not perfect, and we have the best society on earth, but even that isn't perfect. So are we doing psychological damage to point out that the person who wrote that, the first president of our country, enslaved people? Or should we kind of cover that, I don't know what word, ignore it and just point out that he wrote these beautiful, poetic, prosaic words? No, it's we need to look at all of our history and study it. What critical race theory that's problematic that our governor has discussed, and others. And let me tell you, you look at mothers. The reason that they are so angry and taking so much interest in the school system is because it's their children, and what they don't want is someone to tell their child that he or she is responsible for that abuse or that injustice. That is what has inflamed the mothers. Really, the mothers of our students, is when it transcends the system of let's tell the truth and let everyone know, and let's teach our children what actually happened, but don't say it is your fault, that you are in fact the reason for this, and that you yourself are responsible for it, because they're not. And the fact of it is, that is the critical race theory that has caused the conflagration of mothers and fathers of students. And are we pretty confident that that's really happening, Senator? Is that what's really happening? Do you think or not? I don't know. I don't have children in grade school anymore. And the answer that I give to it is, whether it is or not happening, there are those who are living it who believe that it's happening because their children are coming home. And the answer is, I am a firm believer in telling exactly what happened with respect to the abuses that occurred
occurred, and the inconsistencies of what Thomas Jefferson did, including his own, having, a love affair with an African American. The whole point of it is life is riddled with the inconsistencies of individuals who ended up being, great, doing great things. But the answer is that we need to tell the truth. And what happened after the Civil War? You heard the remarks about after the Civil War. Who did that? A group of people who absolutely refused to go along with what was passed by what was deemed to be a radical Republican legislature in Congress. That in fact, the idea that there would be the freedom of individuals who are African American, and the demand that occur. And of course, that had been going on in the freedom of African Americans in the North had been a long time. And that's where the abolitionists were. It was in the South where that continued to be. Once it was done in the 13th, 14th, 15th amendments, 16th, the 15th Amendment. All of these were passed, and what did they do? There was an effort to undermine what had occurred. And look, I can tell you who did it. It was a group of people who at that time were Democrats. And they spent 100 years trying to keep what Republicans had done from actually being effectuated. That's not to say that now some Republicans have completely steered from the principles of Abraham Lincoln, because they have. But let's look at it from the point of view of what happened for 100 years of efforts made by people in the South to separate African Americans from Caucasians and treat them as separate but equal, and then have the United States Supreme Court approve that concept of separate but equal. So there's not been a perfect situation as we go through this travel for equality, but I can tell you what, we've done great things in getting equality in America today.
Thank you. Yes, Representative.
I am a first generation kid, and my parents left a country with currently no democratic system, one with a dictator, to find freedom here. So every day I'm grateful to be born in this country, and I take so much pride in the fact that Orlando is my home. And I now have the opportunity to represent this town that has surrounded my family through so many challenges and struggles with love and joy. With that said, I don't think there's anything more patriotic than looking in your own backyard and saying, we can do better and we must do better. And so when I see these conversations about teaching history in our schools, I have to agree with our dean that I think it's also a misconception of what CRT is, because even in a law school setting, and I speak as a PhD student where I learned CRT in my PhD program as a methodological theory alongside others to apply in understanding problems, is no one's being blamed. The point of CRT is to try to answer questions like, why are there more Black people incarcerated today than white people? Why are there economic disparities along race? What is redlining? Why was that happening? And it's not to point blame to anyone. It's just to understand whether it was intentional or unintentional, that we have some serious dark parts of our history that we do not want to repeat. And so we must learn from that. And I would add that humans are imperfect, and I don't think that's traumatizing to find out. Go through a breakup. My first breakup with a boyfriend was like, you suck. Humans are, as you said, inconsistent. Humans are full of contradictions. We are not gods. And so I don't think it causes harm to a child. You don't got to give it to them heavy, but help unpack the nuances of life. And, I look back at my elementary school upbringing, and I remember me and my sister, I have a twin sister, and we did a Thanksgiving event at my elementary school. And so we were dressed up as pilgrims and Indians. And, I look back at those photos and, that was my childhood. And there's so much, excitement in making those costumes. But now as an adult, I look back and I realize I was not taught the correct history. and those photos are not really appropriate today. I was a child, so I think I can slide by. But I mean, I wouldn't want my kid to dress up as a Native American today. And I think that's okay. I wouldn't want my child to learn the incorrect history, because I think it makes you a whole person to have the facts, and it helps us be better critical thinkers. My biggest concern today in this moment is the targeting of education is intentionally designed to end critical thinking, and the push to demonize higher education is a part of that campaign as well, and the censorship of faculty to the point where if UCF is accused of making a student uncomfortable, they could lose their performance funding. And by the way, it doesn't have to be determined by the judicial system. Thanks to the Florida legislature, it can be determined by the Board of Governors, which is appointed by the governor, or a standing committee of the legislature, which is partisan in nature. And so Representative Randy Fine, who stuck this into a last-minute conforming bill hours before session was over, would be the determiner. He'd be your judge, even though he has never taken the same oath that you took, right? And I think that goes back to the point of how fragile democracy is, how power is being consolidated, and how the solution for us as a community is, even if it doesn't directly impact you, stand up and say something. I think, and the bystander training that happens in these walls is so important to that point. I am not African-American, but I stand up when I see maps being drawn that erase African-American votes. I will stand up in that moment. I am not undocumented, but when I see folks who are being targeted because they're undocumented, I will stand up. I am not LGBTQ+, but I'm an accomplice and an ally. So when I see drag shows being targeted and conflated and so forth, I want to only go to the drag show, but I will protest outside in support of freedom of expression. And so I think it's really important that we take that responsibility, that even if you don't have kids in the school system, to stand up and support good public education. And candidly, a lot of the voices who are organizing under this disinformation umbrella don't even have kids in the school system. So it blows my mind. Some do, but a lot don't. And then a lot of this gets co-opted by outside conservative or liberal dollars to amplify an issue and make it bigger than it is. And that ties back to the concerns of disinformation and social media. So if you see something, say something, and also know how the systems work so you can have a positive impact on top of them.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Representative. Well, here's what we didn't cover. We didn't cover religious freedom in America today. We touched very briefly on Dobbs. We didn't really talk about that decision. We haven't talked much about policing, but our time is up. And so we're going to have to save that for maybe another session or another day.
For sure.
But I want to ask the audience to please, this was courageous for this group of panelists to come and do this. And So Dean and Senator and Representative and Council, thank you very much. And I hope you enjoyed this evening. If you want to come up, they might spend a little more time with you one-on-one, although they also have families to get back to, especially somebody who has 6 children and she better get. So thanks again, everybody. Appreciate it.
It says 2 minutes. It's a 1-minute wrap up. Thank you all very much for coming. We just blanket thank you to the committee, to the speakers, our panelists. We really appreciate all of the time you gave to us this evening. It was fascinating. We can obviously keep at this for another several hours. For those of you picking up CLE certificates in the back of the room, for those of you watching online, they will be in your email. Thank you very much, everybody. Drive safely.